Okay, I'm going to take myself off of camera. Sh- Okay, so welcome to conducting a systematic review, part two, the protocol and the search. Katharine Tepper, I am the Digital and Data Initiatives Librarian here at the Kapasi Library. In addition to being Digital and Data Initiatives Librarian, I also have a systematic review specialization from the Medical Library Association. And so systematic reviews are one of my favorite things to talk about. And so I'm very excited to talk to you guys today about these two specific parts of systematic review process. Last week, my colleague Caroline, she went through the whole big picture view of the steps. And so I might allude to some of those, but we're really going to be drilling down on these two sort of very important pieces that you need to start the process. Okay, so our objectives for today. Um, so first, hopefully by the end of the talk today, you'll understand the importance of the protocol, its necessary parts, and how to register or publish it. You will understand best practices of a comprehensive search process, and finally be able to locate Prisma statements and um, for Prisma statements for for reporting, searching, and for protocols, because there's actually lots of different Prisma statements available. Okay, so I'm sorry if I'm a little bit froggy. My kids gave me a cold. All right, so again, just a reminder that my colleague Caroline last week went into detail on the whole overarching process of the systematic review, and we're just focusing on the protocol and the search today. And so we are going to have that recording up from last week on our website. Um, it will be here. I just put that into the chat, as well as all of the past classes that we have done on systematic reviews are on that website page as well. And that's where this recording will go up also. So it's a great guide to check out. It has all kinds of the recordings as well as lots of good details in the various steps of the process with examples and all kinds of good stuff there. So uh, wanted to put that into the chat for you. Okay, so let's dig into the protocol. Okay, so first, why are we even doing this? It's a big kind of, there's always pushback to the protocol. It seems like a lot of extra work. And so why are you making me do this, basically? And there's three big reasons why you're doing the protocol. The protocol provides you with validity and transparency. Uh, Systematic reviews, by their nature, are extremely scientific in their approach. That's the whole point of them, is to take a sort of loosey-goosey, unscientific process of um, writing a paper, essentially, writing a literature review, and making it scientific. And you want to do the same sort of things that you're going to do with any sort of science experiment or trial. We want to write a protocol. You publish the document that says, these are the things I'm going to do, these are the steps I'm going to take, the tools I'm going to use. And then 9 months, a year, 18 months later, you have the finished manuscript and you can say, look, I did exactly what I said I was going to do. And that gives that sort of validity as well as transparency where people can see, like, yes, that they followed the process. Right? They follow the process that they laid out to at the beginning, and they're not hiding any sort of trickery to massage their results or anything like that. Um, and that's good for science. Number two, it gives you a North Star throughout the process. These are long projects. They can take, like I just mentioned, a year or more to do. And we've all been on group projects, right? And sometimes you think everybody's on the same page, and we're not. You all come back from, whatever you were doing, working on the project, and then uh, realize that we are not all on the same page and you're doing, you know, unnecessary work or doing the wrong, going down rabbit holes we shouldn't have gone down, whatever it was. And this document can be that North Star that everyone on the team can come back to, right? I'm not sure. I've got a question about the inclusion exclusion criterias as you're doing the screening. I got to go back to that document and just like read through them again and make sure I understand, you know, where that line is for, including or excluding a study in our review. Um, uh, and so that's a very helpful thing to have. You're going to outline what everybody is supposed to be doing and all of the other sort of processes that everybody can refer back to and kind of stay on track. And then finally, is that many journals require you to do it. Prisma we'll talk more about Prisma later, but Prisma as a standard has increasingly grown as sort of a best practice that's expected. And so part of that is uh, calling out your protocol right in your manuscript with a link and citation to it. I have been on a number of reviews. I've had two of them published with teams, and in the most recent one that got published, that was one of the feedbacks that we got, that we had to put that into our manuscript because it wasn't in the manuscript in the initial draft. And that made our review better. So just know that to improve your chances of getting published, you do want to make sure you have that. And you don't want to have to be doing it retroactively where you're scrambling at the last minute at the end of this big long process. Do it in the beginning so you have that North Star to guide you and that sort of validity and transparency that can carry your work forward and provide, that little extra oomph to it. Okay, so now that I've given you the whole spiel on why, what is it? What should be in it? And generally, you're going to want 3 sections: administrative details, an introduction, and a methods section. And so these are not terribly long documents, like page, maybe 2. It's not really, the writing of them shouldn't be that much work. It's really going through all of the details with your team and making sure, like I said, everybody understands what's going to be happening and what, is on the same, making all the decisions about what you're going to do as a team. That, takes the time in terms of writing up the protocol, but that pays dividends down the road. Okay, so in administrative details, that's your basic info. Your title, your authors, including the roles. So, author A and B are going to be the primary reviewers. Author C is going to be tiebreaker. Author Z is going to do the data extraction and analysis, whatever it's going to be for your team. Author A and D are going to write it. Just thinking through like how you're going to divvy up the work, because it is a lot of work. And it is useful to do that in the beginning. And then this is also where you're going to put your registration and publication, like where you're putting this thing in the world. This document specifically, not your eventual manuscript, but the protocol document. Then your introduction. And so this is your why, essentially. Why does this review need to be done? What does it add to the literature? Has no one done a review on this topic before, or no one's done one in like 10 years? It needs to be updated. All of that important stuff, as well as your research question, right? All reviews are answering a very specific question. And so your question should be in the protocol. And then finally, this is the meat of it, and it's your methods. The how. How are you going to do the review from start to finish? What inclusion and exclusion criteria are you going to use when you screen your articles? Where are you going to search? What sources? A brief draft, it does not have to be your complete search. Just some sort of terms is fine. um, because the search process itself can take a long time. Uh, but a bit of search, like, oh, we're looking at these mesh terms. We're going to get to all of this in a minute. Um, you know, thinking about what terms are going to go into your search, um, and then your process. So the tools you're going to use. Are you going to use Covidence? Are you going to use, another tool? Um, and then what data are you expecting to extract? Again, expecting it doesn't, it may not be exactly what happens. Protocols can change. Excuse me. And that's fine. You can update them. We'll talk about that in a minute. But your general hope, your goal. Are you planning on doing meta-analysis, or are you just planning on doing sort of more descriptive analyses? Um, and like what what sort of data are you hoping? What like outcome data are you hoping to extract essentially? What are you going to use for risk of bias? Um, and like I said, how are you going to analyze that data? Are you going to use an SPSS, whatever you're going to be doing, laying it all out. Okay. And so uh, there is a handy guide with Prisma. Um, and so before we get too much further, Prisma stands for Preferred Reporting Items for Systematic Reviews and Meta-Analysis. Prisma itself, without the little dash P here, uh, is a statement. There's an actual paper. Um, we will get to that. That's a great question in the chat from Ashley about recommendations for the best places to search. That is coming up in the search section. So yes, hang tight. Excuse me. Oh my gosh. Ah. Okay. So Prisma P here is just for the protocol. And so there's a handy checklist for the protocol with guides in terms of how to, just what you should be describing in each section of the protocol. So sorry. Whoop. Let me grab. I have the link to the Prisma protocol. Goodness, it's not working. Sorry. Okay. Okay, so there's the Prisma statement for protocols, link in the chat. Um, and so writing the protocol doesn't have to be that hard, essentially. You can follow this as a kind of template guide to write up your protocol. Okay, and now finally, we've talked about registering and publishing. Depending on where you're putting it, they use different words. Essentially, it should be public somewhere. So we have that transparency and validity that we talked about at the beginning. So the two biggest ones that I tend to recommend are Prospero and OSF. Prospero is highly regarded, um, and they do check your protocol. They'll read through it. They don't, from what I understand, do a lot of really thorough reading. It's not like totally peer review, but it's close. And so that's nice. It gives you a little extra validity, right? That someone else has looked over and said, like, oh yeah, this all makes sense, what you're doing. You're not just, you know, uh, creating something that doesn't make any sense. The problem, of course, is that it is a little bit more time consuming because it does have a turnaround time. And then if you do need to make any updates to your protocol, it is more difficult to update in the Prospero registry, though it can be done. It is they don't want you to do a lot of updates. They want you to be submitting your kind of final draft um, with hopefully no updates. So um, Excuse me. Sorry, again, this cold. But it's still, uh, one of the most well-known and well-regarded places to register a systematic review protocol. However, they only take systematic review protocols. They do not take scoping review protocols, which are very similar, um, and sort of other sort of similar types of evidence synthesis. They are quite narrow. So if you're thinking of a scoping review or something similar, the process is all pretty much the same, but um, Prospero is not going to be interested in your protocol. Excuse me. OSF is actually one of my more favorite things to recommend because it is free and it's open. Um, and basically, you can put pretty much any sort of research product up onto OSF. Um, and it does provide you with that sort of link back to, make a citation for, not quite a citation, but a link back, a permanent link to your document. Um, and um, you can have revisions and like versions that all kind of live together. So if you do need to update it, it's a little bit nicer in terms of the organization for there. Of course, the trade-off is there is no external person um, reviewing for, clarity of content of your protocol. Um, that said, OSF is still great. It is one of the most popular places to publish a protocol outside of Prospero. And of course, if you're doing something like a scoping review or other type of review that's not exactly systematic review, but close, OSF is probably your best bet. There are also journals that just publish protocols. Again, that's great because you do get that sort of uh, peer review process, essentially, of somebody else reading and making sure that your protocol makes sense. But the turnaround time is the trade-off there. Um, and then, of course, they're generally specific to a subject area or, discipline area. So there may or may not be one that's appropriate to your topic. And you'd have to do some looking into that. There's not as many of them. Again, so my recommendation usually to people who are looking for places to go is OSF, or if they really want that external validity of and that name brand, then Prospero. Okay, so that sort of wraps up our protocol talk. Any questions on the protocol before we jump into the search? Okay, cool. All right. If any do come up, feel free to throw them in the chat. That's cool. Or we could talk about it more at the end. Protocols are pretty straightforward. And I hope that this has helped you feel like more comfortable actually jumping in and doing the protocol because it really does help you save time and headache later, having thought through all of that sort of before all of the process stuff before you actually start doing the process. Okay, so the search. Ooh, here we go. So, some best practices for searching before we get into the details. When we're doing a systematic review, uh, these are when I'm looking at a review, what I'm looking at as a quality is like putting a higher quality stamp on it when it hits these things. So, for sources, three minimum databases. And to the question that was in the chat earlier, we will get into those in just a second in terms of what I would recommend. But 5 to 7 is like the sweet spot for me personally. I like to see 5 to 7. When you get beyond 7, it's just sort of like, whoa, okay. A little bit crazy, but it's a lot. And you're probably not adding too much more for all that extra work, but 5 to 7 is good. 3, bare minimum. If you've done less than 3, I'm not really going to keep reading your review. Um, if you've only done PubMed, that's not a systematic review. I'm sorry. Right. That's just the way it is. Because again, remember sort of the motto of the systematic review is that we're being scientific. And so we have to try and gather as much as possible um, and put all of those things through the scientific process. And just one source is going to be biased, basically, towards whatever's included in that source. We want to open up our options as much as we can without, again, going crazy and trying to gather everything. We're not computers. Okay, so the search that you are doing has to be comprehensive, and we will talk about that. We're trying to capture as much as possible in the literature that's relevant to your topic. And so I expect to see a very comprehensive search strategy called out in the paper. Um, you're not using any filters or limits that are built into the database. So filtering it by year or study type in the actual database itself. Um, excuse me. This is because, in terms of transparency, when we're talking about science, we did not make those databases and we do not know how those filters, but there's not a lot of transparency into those filters and limits and how they work. Also, particularly, filters are not perfect. If you use a filter for, say, like a study type, like randomized control trials in PubMed, you can click that little filter. Um, it's notoriously not great. I have seen it a number of times miss randomized control trials and also give me reviews when I have that filter checked. So that uh, don't use that filter particularly when you're trying to do a review. Save it for your screening process because as a human, as a group of humans doing this all together, you're going to be better at judging than that little checkbox filter that's computer code that it can have bugs, it can just be poorly coded, whatever it is. Um, don't use those filters or limits in the database. The one caveat in terms of years is that you better, if you're going to cut off by year, if you're not going to go all the way back to inception of database. So inception of database is the best practice. Um, basically anything that's included in the database on your topic. You have to have a very good reason why you're using the year, right? And there are good reasons. So for your topic, you know, this drug was discovered in 1999. So there aren't really going to be any papers about it before like 1998, right? So we'll put 1998 as our cutoff. And we are going to explain in our paper that the drug was founded in 1999 or discovered in 1990 or manufactured, whatever it is, in 1999. And that's why we're using that as a cutoff, right? We're not going to just be like, oh, 15 years, right? Because, right? That's generally not considered a best practice um, in terms of systematic reviews. So if you're using a year, it has to be a good reason why. All right. And then your search is going to use both subject headings and keywords in it. So we'll talk about mesh terms and other subject headings in a minute. Um, but you're going to need both keywords and mesh and subject headings in your search to make sure that it's comprehensive. We're going to record the dates that we search because those need to be reported in our review. And you're going to record the total number of records, so articles, that are identified from each database or source. And then finally, a peer review on your search string is a fantastic idea. That is absolutely a best practice. If you can have me or one of the other librarians at the library look over a review, that would count. If you are an all-student team, it might be a good idea to have your search also looked at by a expert in the field, if a clinical field, um, somebody with clinical knowledge on the topic, because they have that sort of clinical knowledge about the words that you might be using and old names for drugs or, oh, it used to be called this, that sort of stuff can be helpful to add to your search. Okay, so now we get to the question, sources. So, in terms of sources for reviews, PubMed or Medline, they are the same thing essentially. So it's really about whether you like searching on the PubMed public platform or going onto the databases that have Medline, which is basically PubMed, and searching there. It's really a search preference, whether you're going to do one or the other, which one you're more comfortable with. Personally, I like PubMed better. Um, but it's all the same content, so it doesn't really matter. But you'll see sometimes people say they search Medline or they'll say they search PubMed when you're reading a review. Um, and it should almost always be included in your review, unless you're not doing a review on medicine, which I assume you all are. Um, excuse me. And then the next one's going to be Embase. PubMed and Embase are really sort of standard. They're I expect to see them in every single review that I look at. They're always there, those two. And then, from there, it gets more of a choose your own adventure in terms of the topic and what's available to the researchers. But Embase is a very large uh, database. It has a lot of stuff that is not in PubMed, as well as stuff that is. It overlaps. Um, and so it's very good, especially like at getting some stuff from like Europe and outside of North America that doesn't get into PubMed. It's also very good at pharmaceuticals and devices as well. So if you're doing anything that's related to pharmaceuticals like drugs or medical devices, you really need Embase for sure. But for almost any review, I really expect Embase. And then from there, Web of Science or Scopus. These are two different products, two different database products, but they do a very similar thing that we'll talk about later in terms of letting you search sort of backwards and forwards from a single citation. And then Google Scholar is good for getting the gray literature that's a little bit outside of usual databases. Um, the thing about searching with Google Scholar is that you need to sort of decide how many pages of results you're going to take beforehand. Typically, when I have done reviews, I do like 5 or 10, depending on how good I think the results are, because they do tend to tail off. But Google, the way it works is it just gives you 100,000 results, and you're not going to put 100,000 results in there because page 55 of the results are not going to be relevant anymore likely, um, or not nearly as relevant as the first 5 or 10 pages. Okay, and then Cochrane Central is a really great resource, particularly if you're doing a review that you're looking for RCTs or other clinical trials. Um, if you're doing a review that doesn't need those things, then Central's not going to be useful to you because it really is just clinical trials and systematic reviews in there. There's nothing else. Um, but again, really good for that. Um, and then other specialized databases, CINAHL is for allied health. So if you're doing something that might involve nursing or physical therapy or sort of anything in that sort of allied health space, um, then CINAHL is what I would recommend absolutely to be included. Um, and then, of course, there are other collections like psychology, behavioral science collection. If you're doing something more towards the psych or mental health space, and then health policy reference center is more public health. So if you have something that's more towards the public health side, you might want to choose that one. There are other ones out there, again, that might be very niche in terms of your question. And that's something that is a great thing to come to a librarian and talk through. But in terms of like baseline, uh, PubMed, Embase, Web of Science, Google Scholar, and Cochrane Central, if it's as long as it's not a review that's looking at like case reports, um, those would be my top five. Again, unless there's some other sort of special need in terms of um, the question. And I hope that answered the question in the chat. But if you have more questions about what I just said with the sources, feel free to let me know. Okay, and so now we're going to move on to building a comprehensive search. And so this is sort of how I visualize, and I try and like explain what we're doing with when I say comprehensive search, what does that even mean? So we're going to imagine that all of these dots, both colors, represent the articles that are like in all of the databases that we've chosen to search. And the yellow ones answer your question, and the blue ones don't answer your question. And so what we need to do is draw a circle essentially around as many of them as possible to capture as many yellow ones as possible. Oh, I see that question in the chat. So just to finish my thought on this before I forget. So essentially, you will always probably miss some, but the goal is to get as many as possible. Okay, the question in the chat is a person should not search both PubMed and Medline as they're essentially duplicate to each other. Yes. Um, there is absolutely no need to search both. Uh, they will just give you duplicate results that you'll have to deal with later. Um, and you are going to get lots of duplicates in your search process anyway. So I would not recommend both. Um, Web of Science and Scopus are not duplicate of each other. They do the same thing, but they have different. Um, so Scopus is actually part of the same company that does Embase, and Web of Science is the same company that does EndNote, like the citation manager. And so they don't cover the same material exactly. Um, but what they do is they let you citation search, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. Um, and essentially, so they do the same sort of thing in terms of like telling you how many times a paper has been cited in your like in the results of the search. So you can see what papers are important, like have been cited a lot. Um, when you search. And so that's why they sort of I put them together is because I don't necessarily think like you could search both and you might get different things. Um, but the real power of them is that sort of citation searching power. Um, so it's really up to you. You could do both. We have access to both now. Um, we actually recently got Scopus as a library. So it used to just be like, I would just be like, Web of Science, that's what you're doing. Now you really have a choice. You could do both if you wanted to, um, or you can sort of choose between the two. Um, yeah, I don't have like a better answer for that, unfortunately. I hope that answers your question. Um, yeah, does that answer it? Yeah, no, I can't hear you. Sorry. Okay, cool. You say you answered. Okay, great. But please feel free to submit more questions. That's great. Okay, so uh, getting back to the slide, the comprehensive search strategy, right? We're always going to miss some of the yellow dots in our search strategy, but and we're always going to have blue dots in our search strategy that we're going to have to get rid of in our screening process. Like we can't avoid them; they're just too close. But we want to draw the best line we can to capture as much as we can possibly to do through the screening process. Okay, and so the way we're going to do this is by building a concept search. And the sort of uh, other visualization that I like to use for explaining how this works is a Venn diagram, right? We're going to separate our concepts out from our question, and then we're going to overlap all of those concepts and the literature, that red line that we just drew, will ideally be the middle of this Venn diagram, right? It'll be all of the stuff that matches those three concepts together when we search. And so let's walk through what that actually looks like in an example. Okay, so we're going to take this example, which is a variation of what actually a scoping review that I've worked on with someone from PT, faculty from PT. And so you're going to identify your key concepts. And so using a framework like PICO can be helpful. You don't have to, but it's something that could be helpful to you in terms of identifying, oh, what's my population, what's my intervention, what's my outcomes. You know, if you're not if you're not asking that kind of question, it may be less helpful. But what we're trying to do is really just get rid of all of the extra words and narrow it down to just our concepts. So in our example question, which is in children with cerebral palsy, gross motor function classification system level 4 or 5, do standing postural control interventions affect quality of life outcomes? Um, and so it's quite specific, just to like circle back to this question. Systematic reviews should be answering specific questions. And so it's pretty clear who our population is here, right? Very specific classification level for this condition. And then what we're looking at are standing postural control interventions. So that's a very fancy way for saying like different kinds of braces or other sort of equipment to encourage standing. And then quality of life, that's a little bit loosey-goosey, but uh, that's sort of where we're at. So those are our concepts. Oops, I did not click through in the right order. Okay, so our first concept, that's our population. If we're using the PICO framework, is this whole concept of children with cerebral palsy, um, the standing postural control interventions, and the quality of life. Technically, children actually, I made a little bit of a mistake here, is a separate concept from cerebral palsy. This is more of a PICO frame where they would be smushed together. But we sort of pulled all of the important words essentially right out of our question. And we're ready to move forward. So now we're going to take a quick pause on, because I think I got my slides out of order. Okay, so yeah, I did. Oh well. So we'll take a quick pause here and we'll talk about subject headings. So we've pulled out our words and we need to come up with our subject headings for our concepts. And where do we find those? And so for PubMed, subject headings are mesh, and you can find those when you go into PubMed and you locate an article. You'll see over on the side bar on the right-hand side, mesh terms, which I've got circled there. That will drop you down to a list of mesh terms at the bottom that you can copy over for your own use in your search. And I believe I forgot to mention it. In your protocol, you should have identified 5 or 10, somewhere in that range, articles that meet your inclusion and exclusion criteria. And so before you do your like big actual search, there is some searching that happens right at that protocol level before you start. That kind of proves that you have some there, right? That there is something to find when you go out and you're going to do your big, huge search. So you should be doing like little searches around to see what pops. And while you're doing that, you can start to gather those mesh terms that, again, you're going to probably call out in that protocol. And so that's how we're going to find them. It's just going to the articles that we like, or might even be close, and then we're going to hit that mesh terms, and then at the bottom, we'll find them. All right, and then this was the slide. I think it was supposed to be before that slide. But anyway, so back to our question. In children with cerebral palsy, uh, we have pulled out our concepts. So this is just the acronym for this long, big thing about the classification system, the CPGMFCS 4 or 5. And so if we went in and we found an article, it would be tagged with this mesh term in PubMed, which is just cerebral palsy mesh. They are not always that straightforward, so you should not guess them. Definitely you need to find them in PubMed. You can also, there is a whole database in PubMed that you can search. It's sort of behind PubMed, I like to say, which is the mesh database, and you can look for terms in there to pull out as well. Um, excuse me. And so, like I said at the very beginning, right, in terms of best practices, I'm looking at the subject headings and the keywords. And so, obviously, I've gone through and I filled out a whole bunch of them, but this is not necessarily a complete search at this point. Um, it's just some of what, just for space, we're going to include here. Um, and so again, you can see I like to build out tables like this. It helps me stay organized. I can keep all of my subject headings together and all of my keywords together. And you're going to want to have as many keywords as possible. Um, any way there is to say the thing, you want to have that way included with an or in your search. Because again, we're trying to draw that big red circle and get as many things as possible. So British spellings, you know, or just other ways to say the same thing, you know, acronyms versus spelling everything all the way out, uh, plural versus singular forms of words, all of those should be included in your keywords. And you always do want to have a keyword for every subject heading. It's not everything in PubMed or other databases gets tagged with the subject headings. It's usually very close. It's usually like 90 something percent. But just to make sure you're grabbing those extra ones, you're going to have, right, the cerebral palsy mesh term as well as the cerebral palsy keyword. Okay, and so this is how we put it all together. All of the concepts are going to be together in a parentheses, or each concept is going to be together, all the words in parentheses, and each of the concepts is going to be added together with and. And so in the Venn diagram example, still each and is another circle of that Venn diagram. The more ands, the smaller our results go, all the way down to 0. And then the more ors we have inside our parentheses, the bigger our results can get, generally to a point. And so I've made all of the ors and ands sort of bold here so you can see them. I kind of spaced the search out more than you might see it in PubMed just to sort of visualize what we're doing and how we went from that table to this search. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, now this is almost ready. And again, this search is not the full search that, again, I worked on this review. It's not quite the same thing, the quality of life thing I threw in changed it up a little bit, but the gross motor function, there's a whole bunch more. That's like actually a paragraph long in my final search for this one. But just for space, I just cut it off because, you know, but to give you an idea that your searches can get quite long and chunky when you're making them up. Okay, now, something that often gets overlooked but is very helpful for your search are field tags. And so, like we have that little bracket where it says mesh after our subject headings, and this is all PubMed search right now. You can also add other tags to your keywords. And so the tag that is the one that I recommend the most and the one that I use anytime that I'm doing a systematic review is TIAB. That's what we call it as librarians. And it stands for title abstract. So now you'll see I put that TIAB tag on every single one of my keywords. And basically, it's a tag that tells PubMed, and again, because this is specific to PubMed search so far, that I only want you to look for this in the title and the abstracts, right? And so this is very helpful for acronyms particularly, because acronyms might come up like a CP might be in somebody's name. Like it could be like Smith, comma CP, right? Is the author of that article, and that's why it's coming up in my results if I don't have that TIAB tag. Right. So it could be a completely unrelated article that's pulling through just because, something is hitting and that just is coming through because that TIAB tag is not there. So TIAB tags will restrict you a little bit, but almost always it's a quality restriction in terms of cutting out some of the results because if these words are in the title and abstract, it's a very good sign. That's what the article is about, right? And if those words are not in the title and abstract, but it's still coming through somehow, it's less likely that's going to be as important to your results. So field tags, again, improve the search results you get a bit. Um, and so they are highly recommended to use in your search. Okay, and now the biggest question, because oof, I gotta get going here. How do I know when to stop? This comes up every single time I talk to someone about a review, and there's no real hard and fast answer. You cannot sort of say like, oh, I'm going to stop when I get to X number of results, because that's not how the science works. We have to just accept whatever results we get. Um, And so the keys that I use when I'm doing these searches are these variations of these three things happen. Either the number of results stops changing when I add more terms to my concepts. So I add another synonym or another spelling, and I'm not getting any more results. It's always, 100, 100, 100 every time I'm trying to rerun the search. And so like, okay, that must be like tapping out. I must be hitting the maximum that I can get with all of this combination of words. Um, if the number of results is growing, but the new stuff, it's seeming less and less relevant to my question, like I'm getting off track, then I'm probably adding stuff in that is pulling things that are irrelevant. So maybe I've got bad words in here. I've got to go back to a previous version, and that's where I've got to stop at that one, right? Or finally, another check is all those target papers that you found in your protocol, your 5 to 10 target papers um, that fit your inclusion exclusion criteria perfectly. They show up in your results. You do a little control F in PubMed and you're looking for the title and it's popping up. It's in one of your pages of results. If all of those are showing up, then that's good. You've captured them with your search and hopefully captured lots of things that are similar to them. If they are not showing up, then you're missing something, and you could be missing other papers that are similar to them. And so you got to tweak your search to hopefully capture those 5 to 10 articles. Okay, and so once you've finished with one database, I almost always start with PubMed personally. Um, that's really, there's many reasons, but that's where I usually start. And you want to finish. You want to get to that point where it's like, okay, I'm ready to stop, like I said on the last slide, and then move on to the other databases because you don't want to have to go back and forth. It can be very confusing. Um, like, oh, like this search like worked really this term. Oh, I didn't realize I needed that term. I've got to go back to PubMed and add that term. Like it's very confusing to search that way. And like keep track and keep organized. So I really recommend just do one first, then move on to the next one, then move on to the next one, then move on to the next one. And we call the process of changing your search from one database to the other translation. And so for subject headings in PubMed, it's mesh. In Embase, it's Emtree because they're not all the same, of course. Um, and but Cochrane Central also does use mesh, so that's helpful. And then Google Scholar and Web of Science don't use any. And I'm actually not sure if Scopus uses Emtree. It might, it probably does. I just haven't done enough with it yet myself because we just got it. Um, for the field tags, PubMed, it's the TIAB in the brackets. In Embase, it's TI, comma, AB after a colon. In Cochrane, it's a colon, TIAB, and then you can also add KY for keyword. And Google Scholar, obviously, is nothing. And then with Web of Science, it's a drop-down menu where you select topic when you're searching, and that searches titles, abstracts, and keywords only. And so I'm going to show you an example of what it looks like to translate from one to the other. So on the left side, you see the PubMed search. that we were working with earlier. And this is what it looks like when it's translated over into Embase. Um, so it can be a complicated process. Embase has more subject headings than PubMed does. And so some of the things that are not mesh terms in the left are, you'll see with the EXP slash are um, in Embase, like gait trainer is got its own subject heading in Embase. Because again, it's a bit more device focused. Um, or it's got like extra device stuff going on in it, medical devices. So um, that's just something to keep in mind that it's not going to be an easy one-to-one match. It can be a little bit complicated. So um, do feel free to reach out to a librarian to help you if you're having issues translating um, your search. Okay, and so then I hinted at it with the Web of Science Scopus thing, but this is the sort of bonus points search that after you've done all of the big database searching, you could do citation searching if you really want to get the bonus points. You don't have to, but it is a really great way to sort of double check that you've caught everything, and you might find some interesting things. There has been some references in the library literature that like the reviews that do citation searching find more and have more results that like have better results at the end. But I haven't, it's a lot. So if you have those like target articles that we've mentioned several times that are like, yay, you're the best, you fit all the inclusion exclusion criteria, you can take those into a Scopus or a Web of Science, and those databases let you look backwards and forwards. So you can look at their reference list and link directly to those articles and say, okay, you know, are any of these articles ones that we didn't find in our search that we would want to include? They would meet our inclusion exclusion criteria probably, right? And then you can throw those into your search results in whatever program you're using to evaluate them. And then the same going forward, right, in time. So other papers that have used your number one shiny star article as a reference. Um, and so that article appears in the reference list of these other, papers, or any of these other papers, ones that didn't show up in our search results for some reason, but we might meet our inclusion exclusion criteria. Let's throw those in the pot as well. Usually you're not going to be finding a ton from this, but usually there is something, which is why the literature is like, hey, you like these are actually, it's kind of good. It's kind of good to do this, but it is a little bit above and beyond. So it's, like I said, bonus points. Okay. And then finally, we're at the end. Um, Reporting your search thoroughly. This is key to the whole enchilada in terms of um, the scientific nature of the systematic review is that it's reproducible, that it's transparent, what you did. So following that Prisma checklist, and so there's the Prisma checklist. That's the main one for reporting everything in the review, which is important. Um, and then there's also the Prisma S checklist, which is just about the search. And so both of those are handy for going through and making sure you have uh, covered all your bases and you're um, reporting it out in your review correctly and not missing anything. Uh, trying to put it in the chat, but the copy paste isn't working again. Statement. Search. Okay. And then, of course, both of those links you can get back to the original Prisma statement that I've put in the chat, the Prisma protocol and the Prisma search. The Prisma statement, the primary one, is there as well as lots of other checklists for other variations on the systematic review and similar like scoping reviews. So having the Prisma website handy is great when you're working on these because they have so many checklists that are really great at giving you sort of the structure that you need to follow when you report your review. Okay, and so that just in time. It brings us to the very end. So thank you so much for going on this journey with me through the protocol and the search. And if you would like to meet and talk about your own project that you have in mind, ever go through a systematic review search that you're working on, get it peer reviewed, etc. That link or that QR code right there will link you to the um, appointment form. So please feel free to make a appointment if you want to. If you have any questions, I'm happy to take them for a few minutes if anyone wants to stay on. But yeah, thank you very much.